So we're going to have Pedro Mediano. I believe the current affiliation is Imperial College, although,
Yes,
has
my
multi-affiliation syndrome, apparently, Imperial and UCL. And yeah, he's going to talk about quantifying high-order behaviors in complex systems. So feel free to take it away, Pedro. Thank you.
amazing. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there today. I became quite sick a couple of days ago, and it felt somewhat irresponsible given all the things we learned, a few years back. Um, so I felt a bit irresponsible to, go there and speak to a microphone. So thanks a lot for having me give the talk online. Yes, so my name is Pedro Mediano. I am a lecturer in the Department of Computing at Imperial College London. I also am an honorary lecturer in the Department of Psychology at UCL. That's where the multi-affiliation syndrome comes from. And I'm going to talk about quantifying high-order behaviors in complex systems. Um, so I should start with a bit of a disclaimer. My research is not on hypergraphs per se, but I do work a lot with complex systems, and I think there's actually a lot of synergy between the things that my lab has been working on over the last few years, and hypergraph theory and hypergraph application. So again, it's quite a shame because I would have really loved to go there and hear more about all of you and start new collaborations. But I hope this is inspiring. I'm pleased to get in touch at any point afterwards. So let me start with a quick acknowledgement of the people that actually did the work. Um, so all of the work that I'm going to present today is mostly thanks to Fernando Rosas, Andrea Lupi, and Marilyn Gatica, and also thanks to my postdoc supervisor, Dan Bohr, as well as a few other people that have helped me quite a lot, Michael Gasper, Anil Seth, and Henrik Jensen. Good. So let's get cracking with a bit of an introduction. First of all, I'd like to say a few words about, what it is that we normally do and why am I here. So at Imperial College, I lead the Machine Intelligence and Neural Dynamics Lab in the Department of Computing, where we have a pretty broad set of interests, and those range, roughly between neuroscience, complex systems, and computer science. So we do things like computational brain modeling, machine learning for mental health, consciousness neuroscience, and complex systems theory. And it's mostly, predominantly the last one, theory of complex systems, that I'm going to be talking about today. But as you can see, there's lots of brainy stuff involved. So a lot of the applications that I'll be talking about later in the talk will be a bit more geared towards the neuroscience side of things. So what is our research goal primarily, and how does it fit with the whole program of this workshop? So my research goal, very, very generally, is to discover the principles of collective behavior. Collective behavior defined very loosely as the behavior of large groups of agents acting as a whole. And we see those all over the natural world. For example, again, the example that I'm interested in the most is brains that are composed of many neurons that act together in some mysterious ways. But also we see it across many other natural systems, flocks of starlings being another interesting example of collective behavior. We also see it in man-made environments, such as, for example, artificial neural networks that are themselves made up of lots of tiny interacting neurons, and understanding how they work is, I believe, also a problem of complexity science. And we also see collective behavior in social systems composed, of course, many individuals interacting. And the common principle behind all of these examples of collective behavior is, I would say, the concept of emergence, which is, can be defined informally as, emergence happens whenever the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This is, of course, a very loose intuition. We have tried to, come up with a few formalizations over the years, but hopefully the kind of intuition is somewhat clear. Especially, again, I think this audience should, of all places, have a, somewhat clear understanding of this. Now, when it comes to emergence, again, this idea of the whole being more than the sum of the parts, this is where lots of high order relationships specifically come into play, right? So in all of these examples, there is some notion, there's some sense in which there's some irreducible interaction between a group of entities or agents or individuals that cannot be broken down into, smaller, say, low order interactions between subsets of them. And that is precisely what hypergraphs are really good. Right, so hypergraphs are natural tools to describe complex systems. I'm stealing here this, very pretty hypergraph from a paper by Young et al. In 2021. And the key aspect, the things that makes hypergraphs interesting to me as a kind of complexity scientist, is that they can capture the high order relationships that give rise to emergence, right? Now, what do we mean specifically by this idea of, or by this term, high order relationships? In a hypergraph, basically, you can just you can write down a hypergraph and you have these kind of hyper edges that connect more than two nodes, and that's all fine and good. But exactly what these hyper edges or what these connections or relationships are is something that, well, it's very flexible. And I would like to draw a particular distinction between two types of kind of high order relationships you can have between a set of agents. And I'm going to distinguish between two things. One is high order mechanisms, which very loosely represent what the system actually is. So the structural connections between parts of the system, and the high order behaviors, which is basically what the system does, or the patterns of activity that basically come out of the function of the system. So let me give a very quick example with a hypergraph Ising model. So in a Ising model, you can have something, you typically write down a Hamiltonian of the system, which we see here on the left, and that Hamiltonian can have pairwise or triple or quadruple links, so you can have a full-blown hypergraph, in the Hamiltonian, but that doesn't necessarily translate to, high order, relationships in the behavior of the system, right? So I want to draw this kind of, I don't want to say duality because it's not a mathematical duality, but sort of this distinction between the mechanisms that are basically the structure of the system. In the case of the Ising model, it could be, for example, the Hamiltonian, and the behavior of the system, which is, again, in this particular case of the Ising model, the probability distribution of states that Hamiltonian gives rise to. And one kind of interesting, although perhaps somewhat unfortunate, result here is that there's actually no clear maps between mechanisms and behavior, right? So the fact of the matter is that low order mechanisms can generate high order behaviors and vice versa. So if you have a frustrated spin system, for example, where you have three spins with negative coupling, there's no kind of single configuration that makes the Hamiltonian happy. And then what happens is that if you look at the total correlation, so say a very general measure of the strength of interdependencies, if you look at the total correlation of all three spins together, that is much higher than even the sum of the total correlations of every pair. Right, so this is an example where you have a low order mechanism because you have only pairwise connections in the Hamiltonian, but you have a high order behavior given by a much higher total correlation at the triplet level than at the pairwise level. And this is the kind of behavior, or this is the kind of high order relationships that my work is particularly interested in, and we're going to see lots of different ways of investigating this link between mechanisms and behavior. And one problem that we tackle specifically is how to quantify these behaviors from data, right? So when you just come up with a new data set, we don't really have access to the mechanisms. We can only infer behaviors from the data. So again, in my case, let's say that you pick up your phone, pick up the phone and then call your friend in a neuroscience department. You get a data set from brain activity. There's no clear mechanism behind this. We know a few things about the structure of the brain and the biophysics of the brain, but not very much. So how can we quantify the potentially high order behaviors that might exist in brain activity? The objective of this whole research program is to perform a systematic study of high order behaviors. Specifically, we're going to be using for the rest of this talk information theory, that I think is a very natural framework for both theory and data analysis. So the take-home message from this talk, to conclude this introduction, is that one, we can, or well, rather that quantifying high order behaviors is a fundamental problem in complexity science, and that often a single hypergraph isn't enough, actually. So there are different kinds of high order behaviors that may warrant different types of study, perhaps bringing or like calling for multi-layer hypergraphs type of analyses. And there's plenty of problems at the intersection of information theory and hypergraph theory. So this is more of a call for ideas, a call for collaboration than anything else. Again, if you're interested about anything that I'm going to say from now on, or anything I've said so far, please do get in touch. I'd be very excited to see how our research can come together. So for the rest of this talk, there's 3 parts left. I'm going to try to definitely keep it within time. In part 1, we're going to talk about the concepts of synergy and redundancy and information decomposition that are some of the core concepts we've been working on in terms of these high-order behaviors. And then we're going to go through 2 applications somewhat quickly. Apologies. First, we're going to look at an application involving high-order behaviors in brain aging. So what happens to your brain as you get old? And then we're going to go through another application talking about or like looking at the topology of synergy and redundancy networks in the human brain. So let's get started. And let's start with information decomposition, which is, again, the main kind of theoretical workhorse that we use in the lab. The ideas behind information decomposition start from a relatively basic but somewhat understated fact, which is that quote unquote not all correlations are born equal. So what do we mean? If you have, let's get within the realm of statistics and stochastic processes, 2 random variables can either be correlated or coupled or not. And this is measured by the standard Shannon mutual information, right? Which I'm not going to go into the details of the math. I prefer to stick with analogies, and I like this analogy of 2 interlocked rings, right? So if you have 2 variables that are statistically dependent, then you can, we're going to represent those with 2 interlocked rings. And we have very, very clear ways of determining from data whether 2 variables are independent or not. The problem is, or the interesting part comes from when you have 3 or more variables, because in this case, there are different types of correlations that you can have. And some of them are visible from the parts, and some of them aren't. So let's look in particular at the set of rings on the left. By the way, these are called the Borromean rings, in case someone has seen them before. And I'm going to ask you to do a mental exercise. So again, focus on the rings on the left and mentally remove the green ring. What happens to the blue and the red rings? They actually come apart, right? So all 3 rings are, tied together, but as soon as you remove one of them, then the other 2, become free. So this is a particular type of, high order correlation that is actually not visible from any of the parts. And this is what we call synergy in the information theoretic sense. If you look at the set of rings on the right, the opposite happens. So if you mentally remove one of the rings, the other 2 still remain locked. So there is a type of statistical relationship that is, an intrinsically 3-way relationship, because it's more than 3 pairwise connections between the 3 rings, but also it is such that if you remove one of the rings, the other 2 remain locked. And this we call redundancy. So the realization that you have these different types of correlations is very important, and is what we're going to try to, or it has been the subject of quite a growing body of mathematical literature. Let's get slightly more precise with this. Again, I'm still going to stick to analogies because I think those are generally useful for talks. I'll flash a list of references at the end in case anyone wants to read through the papers. But let's actually go through another intuition, and this time we're going to do it with a crime mystery. So let's say that we got to the workshop and someone ate all the cookies, and our goal, or we hire a detective to find out who of these 9 suspects actually ate all the cookies. And for this, we get 2 witnesses that are going to provide different bits of information about who was it that stole the cookies. And for example, the first witness on the top might say something like the culprit had a mustache, and that immediately rules out some of the suspects. And this provides information in the formal sense of the word, right? Which is it excludes probability mass. So we have learned something, we have gained information from learning that the culprit had a mustache. And then the witness might also say that the culprit had a hat, and that basically leaves 2 possible suspects for this. So the first witness, again, provided some information, but wasn't able to actually narrow down which of the 9 suspects was the culprit. The second witness might, for example, say that the culprit had a mustache and that they had red hair. And again, this leaves 2 suspects that are plausible. And notice how none of the witnesses in isolation is actually able to pin down the culprit, but if you combine information from both, then you know that it was actually that, guy on the right that stole all the cookies. So if we try to put this a bit more, diagrammatically, you can draw a little Venn diagram. And this basically shows that these two witnesses provide three different kinds of information about, the culprit. First, you have this redundant information, so the information that you obtain from both. It's a sort of equivalent of an intersection in set theory. Then you have these two bits of unique information, which is information that you get from one witness but not the other. And then you have this interesting bit, which is the synergy, right? Which is information that you get from both of them together, but none of them in isolation, right? And you can see how this basically maps to the intuitions that we developed earlier with the rings, but it makes things slightly more precise. And there's a very deep mapping between information decomposition and set theory that I would also be happy to get into later. So this was all formalized by Williams and Beer in 2010 in this framework called the partial information decomposition, or PID, where you split mutual information in three terms, one of them being redundancy, one being unique information, and one being synergy. And again, coming from this idea, from these interests in complexity science and emergence and higher order relationships, I would argue that perhaps one of these atoms that is more interesting is the synergy, which quantifies information that is contained on the whole, but not in any of the parts. So again, going a tiny bit more mathematically, the kind of formal setup of this framework of partial information decomposition is that we have two predictor variables, x1 and x2, and we have one target, y. So these are all potentially coupled random variables. And from these, we can calculate three things using the standard Shannon information theory. We can calculate basically how well both random variables predict the target y together. And this is the joint predictability given by a standard mutual information. And we can also calculate this marginal predictability. So how well does each one of them, x1 or x2, predict the target y separately? And what happens again is that sometimes the whole, so the predictability you get from both of them together, is greater than the sum of the parts. And this is precisely the kind of phenomenon that Williams and Beer were trying to calculate. And the PID postulates that basically this kind of joint predictability, this joint mutual information, is just a sum of these four types of information: the redundancy, unique information, and synergy. Now, in terms of how you actually calculate this, well, there's a big pile of papers on how to do this. It turns out you don't always have to actually get all of these numbers, but we'll get to that in a minute. So a perfect example of synergy is the XOR gate, where you have two binary inputs, x1, x2, that are independent of each other, and the output is basically whether the two inputs are equal or not. And the particular feature that makes the XOR interesting is that knowing one input tells you nothing about the output. So these marginal mutual informations are both zero. Nonetheless, if you know both inputs, then you can predict the output perfectly. Right? So this is a genuine example of synergy, of pure synergy, in fact, because all of the information contained in the system is only at the high order, but there's nothing in any of the pairwise marginals. So if you were to just build, say, a graph between these three variables by calculating pairwise connections, you wouldn't see anything. There's only a triple-wise high order connection between all three of them that cannot be reduced to any of the pairs. So far so good. The PID is, I believe, a really beautiful theory with lots of very interesting results. But now when it comes to actually calculating this thing and building real hypergraphs and kind of working on applications, there's quite a few limitations. And one of them is that actually calculating these values of synergy and redundancy and unique information becomes really, really hard as soon as you start working with large systems. So it's really computationally challenging for reasons that I will not get into now, but again, feel free to ask later. Luckily, though, what happens is that the balance between synergy and redundancy is often very easy to compute, right? So calculating a number for synergy and the number for redundancy is usually not usually, but in large systems, it can be quite hard. But the difference between the two turns out to be quite easy for some mathematical, conveniences that happen. So let's consider two separate cases for these practical measures of synergy and redundancy. One of these two separate cases is a suite of undirected measures that you can apply, for example, when you have a set of multiple EEG or fMRI channels. So there's no clear source or target division. You just have a multivariate complex system that's evolving jointly over time. And then we can also consider a set of directed measures. For example, when you perceive a stimulus or you perform an action, how is the information about the stimulus represented in a set of neurons or in a set of brain regions? So let's look at both of these cases in turn. What are the undirected and the directed measures of this balance between synergy and redundancy? In the case of the undirected measures, there's a particular measure that we put forward in a 2019 PRE paper called the O information. So if you have a system of n variables that I'm collectively denoting by x, just a concatenation of x1 through xn, the O information quantifies the balance between redundancy and synergy. So it's given by that particular combination of Shannon entropies, denoted by the standard notation H. And don't worry about the particular formula too much. The really important part is that the O information of a set of variables can be shown to be the difference between redundancy and synergy, right? So you don't have to worry about all of the details of the PID. If you can calculate the entropy of subsets of your system, which is usually a fairly easy task, then you get this kind of aggregate balance of, is my system predominantly redundant or predominantly synergistic? And notice that the scales linearly in n, so it can actually be applied to fairly large systems. And indeed, if we apply this to some toy datasets or to some toy systems, that's exactly what we find. So in the system on the left, we have a copy gate where x1 is equal to x2, it's equal to x3. If you calculate the O information for those, you get 1 bit, which is greater than 0, and that shows that the system is predominantly redundant. So you can think of it as an army, sort of basically all the variables either going up or down in synchrony, perfect synchrony. And in the system on the right, if the 3 variables are linked through an XOR gate, then the O information is -1, which is negative, meaning that you have a predominantly synergistic system. In the case of the directed measures, and we're not going to go through this in great detail, but suffice to say that there is another measure called the redundancy synergy index, given by, again, a linear combination of standard Shannon mutual informations. That, like the O information, it's positive for predominantly redundant systems and negative for predominantly synergistic systems. And this has a bunch of interesting links with information geometry and graphical models, which again, I won't get into right now, but if you're interested, feel free to check out that paper in the IEEE Information Theory Symposium this year. Good, so what have we got so far? So far, we've seen that information decomposition reveals different kinds of high-order behaviors, such as synergy and redundancy, right? So one thing that I would be very delighted to work with some of you would be to actually build or consider the hypergraph structure, the hypergraph properties of these synergy and redundancy hypergraphs, and see what we can learn from them in different systems of interest. And these could be built with any of these practical data analysis tools, such as the O information and the redundancy synergy index, which are available. And we have a bunch of code that's basically ready to go, both in MATLAB and Python. Again, drop me a line if you're interested in any of this. So for the last 10 minutes or so, let's go and look at a couple of applications. The first one is going to be brain aging. So what do we do? And by the way, here I'm presenting this paper led by the brilliant Marilyn Gatica a few years ago. So Marilyn grabbed fMRI data of 164 subjects across the lifespan from ages between 20 through 80. We parcellated the brain into a bunch of regions of interest, and then we picked a partition with 20 modules, which basically means we have a 20-dimensional dynamical system, or a 20-dimensional multivariate time series, rather. And then we computed these O information measured of many interaction orders. So we basically grabbed all of the triplets, or a large enough random sample of the triplets, calculated the O information, picked all the quadruplets and quintuplets and so on and so forth, up until the very highest order of all of the interactions of order 20 that basically involve the whole system. And for each one of these, basically, the simplest way of summarizing these results is basically to get an average, right? So we compute it for every interaction order, the average of information, so how synergistic versus how redundant the system is. And what we found is actually that as we age, we have a very, very strong increase of all information, right? Which you can see in that plot on the left. So the yellow group is actually the oldest from 60 to 80, and the light blue group is the youngest from 20 to 40. And if you try and break this down into into predominantly redundant endplets and predominantly synergistic endplets, then you see that actually this is due mostly to an increase in redundancy in already redundant subsets of the brain. But then we can take this one step further and we can ask, well, what are the causes of this observed increase in redundancy with aging? And to test this, we actually looked into a kind of more general set of tools given by computational whole brain modeling. So this whole brain modeling is another field of research that aims to produce in silico models of brain activity. And the way these work is by combining quite a few bits and pieces. So on one hand, we can have a map of the different neural receptors that are in different parts of the brain. We apply a cortical parcellation, so which parts of the brain correspond to which kind of region, like say visual cortex or frontal cortex or whatnot. Then we have some functional fMRI data with brain activity and some structural MRI data that basically tells us which parts of the brain are anatomically or structurally connected with one another. Then we add some biophysical model, some actual dynamics, and you press play, you can get a simulation of time series that look very much quite a bit like brain activity. And in particular, we're going to focus on this element on the right, this structural connectivity, which are the anatomical connections between different parts of the brain. And what Marilyn did in a subsequent paper was find a way to artificially age these structural brain connectors. So what we found is that the strength of the structural connections in the brain actually decays quadratically. So the strongest connections are the ones that decay the most. And this, again, the very, very simplest model that actually gave us the data was, again, a super simple quadratic equation, right? So if you want to find out how much a particular connection in the brain decays, from young age to old age, turns out that a parabola is actually not a terrible fit, as it turns out. And then we can basically apply this model to artificially age a young connectome and see what dynamics this connectome would produce if it went through the same neurodegeneration process as induced by age. And indeed, this reproduces the empirical results. So we're looking at the kind of O information of redundant and synergistic triplets, subsets. And in this case, the yellow curve, this I4 tilde, is actually the artificially aged connectomes. And we see that indeed will reproduce the strong increase in redundancy by making this change in the connectome. So let's tie this back to the idea we were talking earlier about mechanisms and behavior. So what we found here is that actually a change in low order mechanisms, which is basically a weakening of structural pairwise edges, cause a change in high order behaviors in the O information of these very large subsets of the system. So the fact that we observe a high order behavior doesn't necessarily mean that we need to explain it with a high order mechanism. Sometimes a low order mechanism is enough, such as in this particular case of degeneration during aging. And now for the last 5 minutes, let's talk briefly about the topology of synergy redundancy networks. Again, there's something that we did using standard networks, so no hyper edges of any sort. I would really, really like to kind of learn more from you and see how we can actually extend this work into the hypergraph domain. So this is a different set of analyses, this time led by Andrea Lupi. And what Andrea did was he grabbed data from the Human Connectome project. So you have 100 subjects undergoing resting state fMRI during 14 minutes. We did a standard pipeline of pre-processing and denoising and parcellating the data. So again, now you end up with a 200-dimensional multivariate time series. And you grab every pair of this 200-dimensional time series, and you calculate synergy and redundancy. You end up with these synergy and redundancy networks spanning the whole brain. And the very, very first analysis that we did was basically just take the average strength of these networks, both in the case of the redundant interactions and the synergistic interactions, and take an average and compare. And this is exactly how this looks like. So if you look at the red regions in that brain, those are predominantly synergistic, and the blue regions are predominantly redundant. And if you're somewhat familiar with brains, this looks this is a quite familiar map. So this part on the right here, that's a frontal cortex. That's basically where a lot of the kind of high order cognition happens. Then you have this blue stripe over here. That's mostly your motor cortex and your auditory cortex down here. So this is it looks a lot, again, if you're coming from the neuroimaging literature, it looks quite a bit like the principal functional gradient, except it has quite a few more instinct properties than it. So what we found is that, again, by just looking at which parts of the brain have more or less strength in the synergistic and redundant networks, we found that synergy is higher in the kind of high-level networks of the brain, such as the default mode network and the frontoparietal networks, and redundancy is higher in sensory motor areas. And this holds not only at a kind of tissue level of like which parts of the brain are here or there, but also if you look at this in terms of a cognitive meta-analysis. So we run this neuroscience meta-analysis, and we found that synergy is indeed higher in areas related with high-level cognitive function. So, for example, if you look at the bottom corner of this matrix, this corresponds to the most synergistic areas of the brain, and these are the areas that are related with these activities or like tasks we would consider high level, such as cognitive control, working condition, social cognition, working memory, and so on. Whereas the most synergistic, the most redundant regions of the brain are associated with more like low-level cognitive tasks, such as auditory processing and multisensory processing and motor behavior, and so on. And then when it comes to the actual topology of these networks, how do these things actually look? So we found that the synergy network is actually more integrated than redundancy. So the synergy network has a much, much higher global efficiency than the redundancy network. But at the same time, the redundancy network is a lot more modular than the synergistic network. And this difference was very, very striking. We corrected this with quite a suite of neural models and surrogate networks and so on, and the results seem quite robust. And not only that, but actually the redundancy network is more aligned with the brain underlying structure. So if you just do a very, very simple correlation to figure out the similarity of these two networks, we find that the redundancy network is a lot more correlated with the structural connectivity, and the synergy is pretty much uncorrelated or very, very slightly positively correlated with structural connectivity. And then we found a few more interesting tidbits that I'm going to breeze through very quickly in the interest of time. So we also found that synergistic neural circuits were uniquely favored by evolution. So actually regions of the brain that are more synergistic were also the regions that were expanded the most in the evolution from chimps to humans. They're also the regions that have the highest density in human-specific regions of the genome. So again, it seems that for some reason, I don't want to speculate on the kind of arrow causality, but there is something in the evolution from chimps to humans that seems to have enhanced the synergistic areas of the brain. And then finally, another thing we tried was to see if synergy correlates with conscious level. So what happens when you actually lose consciousness? So we grabbed a data set from a group of subjects that were, or patients rather, that unfortunately were suffering from unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. So what would previously be called vegetative state, which is people in coma, basically. And we found on the left here that in empirical fMRI data, as you go down from control, healthy subjects, to minimally conscious to unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, the level of synergy goes down. And again, we were able to reproduce this with a computational whole brain model purely by changing the topology of the network. So this is another example where a change in a low order mechanism actually generated a change in, or explained an observed change in, a high order behavior. So To summarize these applications of synergy and redundancy in the brain, we've actually seen that, good question, that redundancy supports the perceptual and motor input output to the brain because it's higher in sensory motor areas and it's supported by the actual structure of the brain, whereas synergy supports high-level cognitive function, so it's higher in associative areas, and it's also higher when we are conscious. So wrapping up, what we have presented in this talk is practical tools to quantify high-order behaviors from data, right? So these are based on the general framework of PID, but the more practical tools are these things called the O information and the redundancy synergy index that I would love to actually apply these or like build hypergraphs with these. And there's a few papers out there, but not nearly enough studying hypergraphs built with O information and redundancy synergy index. I think there's lots of potential in there. And then another thing we've seen is that computational modeling can link mechanisms and behaviors in real data, for example, in the case of brain aging or in disorders of consciousness. And we presented some functional evidence that synergy supports cognition and consciousness in the human brain. So that's all I have for you today. If you're interested, feel free to visit my website, or please do drop me a line, and I'll be very happy to discuss how any of this could intersect with some of your research. And thanks a lot for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pedro. I believe I will just pass around the mic for questions so you can hear us. Are there questions? Jürgen.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk, Pedro. I have a
question. Hi, Jürgen.
Hi, Pedro. Yeah, I have a question about your aging study and the losses, the decay of structural connectivity. According to some studies that we have did, I would suspect that it is more specific, that it's not just an overall decay of structural connectivity, but it particularly affects the motor control and the motor cortex, which of course would also be in line with what you have found. Because we have seen that's a basic difference between young and older people, according to other measures, lies in the decay of motor control.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that we looked at only very briefly, let me go back to that particular result. Maybe. So one thing we found is that, again, if you look at only the strength of the weight before and after, so in the young group versus the old group,
yes.
Here. So here we're not plotting every point in this plot is a particular edge, so a pair of regions in the brain, but we're not saying which one they are, right? So this is, again, reasonably well approximated by a parabola, but we haven't really studied very closely which ones these are, or if you were to only change some but not others, would you still reproduce this increase in redundancy with age? I'll be very curious to see, for example, if you were to only modify, as you say, the motor connections, or like only degenerate the motor connections, would you reproduce this increase in redundancy? I don't actually know what the answer would be, but I'll be very keen to find out.
Yeah, that would be quite interesting. Then, and also as a conceptual question, why would a decay in structural connectivity increase and not increase redundancy? Because if there are more if there are weaker connections, then somehow you would expect less redundancy.
Well, we see less synergy.
Yeah, sure,
Again,
sure. But about redundancy, you've seen increase in redundancy if I interpret your graphs correct.
That's a very good question. So bear in mind that although this is somewhat misleadingly labeled redundancy, but what I'm actually plotting is an O information, which is a difference between synergy and redundancy.
Of course, sure. But I mean, then you explained the change in O information by essentially increase in redundancy and only a minor change in synergy.
Yes. So I don't know which of these two tendencies is actually stronger, right? So it could be that maybe this increase in O information is doing some tricks between the balance between synergy and redundancy. I don't actually know what the right answer is here either. But that is what we observe in the data and in the simulations, right? That if you turn the, if you degenerate, basically weaken the structural connections, then you get an increase in information. That's for sure.
Okay, thanks. And let also other people ask their questions.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Yes, there is another one here.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. I have some question for slide 30, if you can
Ooh, okay.
Go forward a little bit. So there's some plots about
Yeah. Sorry, my PDF viewer seems to be having a hard time. This one.
Yes, yes. First, I would like to ask, the first question is, how do you measure the global efficiency? And the other question is, I found it quite curious why the redundancy is associated with structure, but synergy is not. Do you have any explanation for that? Like, we usually assume more connection and higher synergy, so it should be somehow related to the structure.
Yeah, so let me answer your first question first. So you ask, how do you calculate global efficiency? And that's basically just the regular definition of global efficiency as the average of the inverse shortest path length across every pair. I'm not sure if that is the answer you were looking for.
Right, so it's like the bigger the networks, usually the longer the path. And
So both networks are the same size, right? So the nodes are always, the brain regions, which are the same in both cases. But getting from one node to another, on average, takes a lot less, jumping around in the synergy network than in the redundancy network. So the synergy network is more efficient in that particular sense.
Okay.
And then going back to your second question about why is it that the redundancy is more aligned with the brain's structural connectivity, the way I see this is that the redundancy is more about when two random variables have the same information about something, right? And when you have a very strong structural connection, then that means that you have, again, this very strong coupling. That means that you're also more likely to be more correlated, and the more correlated you are, then it makes sense that the information that you have about something else is actually more of the same. So the fact that we have this strong correlation between redundancy and structural connectivity, that makes a lot of sense to me through this idea of, well, more structural connection means more correlation, which means more redundancy.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, or let me know if I missed any parts of your question?
Yeah, like how does the synergy happen? Like if with yeah.
And why is this correlation so low?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the way I see it is sort of as a complement of, the reasoning for redundancy, right? So synergy is, in a sense, a statement about the complementarity of information, right? So if you have two sources of information that are independent, then they can have more potential to, have synergistic information because they have different pieces of information to begin with. And then in that sense, the lack of correlation is actually a good, the lack of pairwise correlation, that is generally more conducive to, a high value of synergy. So if pairs that are structurally connected are more correlated, then basically all other pairs are, probably going to be less correlated, and they'll be likely to have more synergy. And this basically completely break down the relationship between structural connectivity and synergy. Now, why is it precisely that value? I don't actually know, but it does build kind of this picture of kind of synergy as this high order information processing that is kind of hovering above and is not directly mediated by immediate structural connections. this is a somewhat hand-wavy answer, but unfortunately, I think that's as
Yeah.
precise as we get. If you have any other thoughts about how we could explain this, or what would even be a satisfactory explanation, I'll be very happy to hear more about it.
Thanks. That makes sense. I think it's probably there's some structural feature from the graph that can be correlated to the synergy, but but it's not the higher the clustering coefficient, the more synergy. Maybe it's the other way around. The lower the clustering coefficient, the higher synergy. But I'm just assuming that there could be some interesting graph-like metrics that can be used to explain this.
Yeah, so I would love to do a motif analysis, for example, which I know that, for example, Jürgen and others like Joe Lizier and others have a bunch of very interesting work on network motifs and information theory, and I would really love to apply some of this to synergy and redundancy, and maybe that will shed some light on, as you say, some other local topology measures on the relationship to synergy and redundancy. That would be super interesting, I think.
All right. Seems there are no further questions, so let's. Well, Jürgen has another one.
Well, perhaps I can make some comment on this discussion, because that is very interesting and important point. Perhaps redundancy comes from some kind of global synchronization mechanism in the brain, that things are not pairwise exchanging information, but they are globally coordinated by, for example, what is happening in the thalamus, or so the direct is so the sensor information and the feedback between cortical and thalamic regions. And so that then would be a different explanation of redundancy. And then, of course, structural connectivity between pairs of regions is no longer so important.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good observation.
Okay, then let's wish you a good recovery, and hopefully hope to see you soon in person again, Pedro.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be amazing. Again, thanks a lot for accommodating. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm glad that I got to tell you about all of this. I hope you have a great workshop.
Thank you, Pedro. Thanks for joining us remotely.